Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to get to them during the presentation, we will answer them at the end. My name is Braden Knutson. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Online Digital Newspaper Sources. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceedingly Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren.
We are online. We're going to talk about online digital newspaper sources. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this particular topic is that very commonly I will talk to people who have come to me and they'll say the same kind of formulaic thing that they say to me when they've reached some point they can't find what they're looking for. It goes something like this. They'll come and they'll say, "Oh, I need some help finding my great-great-great grandfather, and we've been looking for him for years, and we've looked everywhere. In fact, we even hired a professional genealogist to look for him." And I always say, "Well, yeah, well, why did you come to me?" No, I don't say that, but I do say, "Oh, you've looked everywhere, have you? Oh. Well, I have a lot of standard responses to that, but one of them that I would say is very applicable here is that, have you read the newspapers?" And they'll say, "Newspapers?" Like that. And it's sort of an idea that doesn't really, hasn't really gotten into the mainstream of genealogical resources. Do you understand that for the past 300 years, newspapers have been published in America and now the United States and in other countries of the world. And these newspapers have been stacked up and accumulating and are presently in the process of being digitized. So we're going to talk about where to find these newspapers and what kinds of sources that you can find to get into them. First of all, we need to understand a little bit about searching on the internet, because newspapers are generally held in some kind of a repository, archive, large online database program, or whatever. First of all, there's a difference when you're searching on the web between static and dynamic pages. A static page is like what you're looking at when you go on to any of the websites and a bunch of text comes up on the screen, and you can search, and you search in a Google search and you find a movie or a store or a doctor, whatever you're looking for. Those are static websites, meaning that the information is posted onto a web page and it's searchable by a search engine like Google. A dynamic web page, on the other hand, is maintained behind a firewall. That means that the Google search engine can't get access to that information directly. The information is only made available when a search is made in the database and then put on the web, and then it disappears. And the common thing, for example, is if you go to a library catalog and you go to look up a book. When you look up a book in the library catalog goes to their computer, their hard drive, finds the book you're looking for, displays it on the screen, and when you either copy down the information or go find the book, then that disappears and it's no longer online. And very frequently, that particular database will not be available to a Google search. So if you did a Google search for that same book in that same library, the computer would not find it. The search engine would not find it. So what we're looking at here when we're talking about having large online databases of newspapers is that you actually have to go to each individual catalog online. So what you're doing when you're looking for newspapers and online digital newspapers, meaning newspapers that have been scanned into a database and available to be viewed online, that particular type of website is where you're going to be looking for the websites rather than for individual newspaper articles or searching for the name of your ancestor. So you could search all day on the internet, on Google, for your ancestor's name, and he may be in 1,000 newspaper articles, but they would never show up online. So we need to understand that you really do have to go to each of these websites and do a search with their search engine on their website in order to see if they have the information that you need. Next big point is free versus subscription. We all like free. It sounds good. There are some very, very large free sites out there that have a lot of newspapers. But by and large, newspapers are commercial enterprises. And even if the newspaper publishing company is still in effect, then a lot of the newspaper is copyrighted. So what you're going to have is a situation where they're not going to want to allow people to look at their newspaper archives without receiving compensation. And even if they allow a large online database to look at their or have their newspapers available, they'll probably want some kind of a payment for that, for having that access. So by and large, the largest and the most available newspaper websites, the ones that have huge collections, are all subscription websites. So you just kind of have to understand that that's the reality of the situation. Now, there are lots and lots of free websites out there. There's another issue here. One is that we're getting used to, in genealogy, we're getting used to having 4 large online websites: Family Search, MyHeritage, Ancestry, Find My Past, and a lot of other large websites out there that have information. What is the state of affairs in with newspapers is that they're scattered all over the world in a lot of little websites. So you have, depending on the state, you have anywhere from half a dozen to maybe 20 or 30 different websites hosting different newspapers, some by subscription, some for free, and it begins to be a real task to discover where these particular newspaper holdings are being kept online. Now, first of all, notwithstanding what I said about the static versus dynamic, it is worth your trouble to search Google and Wikipedia for newspaper titles. Now, the concept here is that as you're doing research for your ancestor, the process that you're going to go through generally is to try to locate a place where a specific place where a specific event occurred in your ancestor's life. Be that a birth, death, marriage, sale of a piece of property, getting arrested, whatever it is that's happened to that person. And because of that, once you have a location, then you can use the location to find what newspapers may have been available at the time and place that event occurred. So here's the situation. Let's suppose we're looking for a marriage. Marriage records are usually kept by some type of government agency, sometimes by churches, sometimes in other kinds of records. Land and property records may have evidence of marriages. There's lots of different places to go search for a marriage, but one of those primary ones is newspapers, because newspapers report in the news, and the news generally includes who got married. And so if you're looking in the newspapers at the place where the marriage may have occurred, then you need to know which newspapers may have been available at that time. So there's some, and we'll get to this in a minute, there's some places where you can go to get lists of all the newspapers that have been published in a certain area at a certain time. And so you can use these general online searches through Google and the references that are in Wikipedia to find out information about the newspapers themselves. Excuse me. Now, when we're talking about digital newspapers, we're talking about newspapers, not the paper, but the paper has had an image made through a scanner that has transferred that the photograph, the image of that newspaper page onto into a file format that can be read by a computer and then searched. Most of the larger digital newspaper websites have used what is called optical character recognition, or OCR, to read through all of the articles in the newspaper and make the text available online to be searched by their search engine. So when you start searching in the newspapers, you may find, if you've got a common name, an ancestor with a very common name, you may find thousands of references to John Smith, this and that, and you're going to have to spend additional time refining your searches or being more specific about the places and associated things that may have occurred in your ancestor's life to differentiate that ancestor from all the other people with the same or similar name. Okay, so I'm going to give an example of what kind of things you might find in a newspaper that are quite, may be surprising. Some of them may be disturbing. I debated whether to read this article or part of this article into this webinar, but I decided that it wasn't suitable for younger audiences, so I would probably not do that. But this is an interesting kind of thing that would show up in a newspaper that you may never have found in any other way. This is a story about one of my relatives up in Flagstaff, Arizona, and he came back from being in the war in World War I and had what we would call today battle fatigue or flashbacks or whatever they call syndromes that you get when you get fighting in a war. And unfortunately, he came into Flagstaff on his horse and then wandered off, and it was discovered after a few days that he was missing and that there was no way they didn't know where he was or what had happened to him. Well, the sheriff in Flagstaff decided that he was going to find this person. And so he employed two Native Americans, a Hopi Indian and a Navajo Indian, to help him track down the young man. And so they went out in the desert, but meanwhile it had rained, and so it made it a little difficult to follow any kind of a trail. And it had been a few days since he disappeared, and they didn't find anything. And as a matter of fact, when both of the Indians figured out that they were looking for somebody who might be a dead man, they decided they didn't want to do that, so they quit. The sheriff went back to Flagstaff, and he asked around and found a tracker. And so he had employed this man as a tracker. And now you'd gone out, and it was about a week and a half or two or so after the young man had disappeared. And they went out to the last in the direction that they'd gone. And pretty soon the tracker kind of picked up a bit of a trail, and they found the man's horse. And it was sort of tied up to a bush, and they got the horse loose because the horse wasn't in too good a shape after that, sitting out there for a long time. So then he got down, the tracker got down, and the story, this all in this newspaper story. This whole thing is in this newspaper story. He gets down on the ground and he starts crawling around on the ground, and pretty soon he picks up a trail, and he starts following this trail out across the desert. And you have to imagine this in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is high plateau, up above around 7,000 feet. And it's just desert. I mean, it's just absolutely barren desert. And he's following this trail off and across the desert. He goes for about 2 or 3 miles across the desert, and they find the body of the man that died, apparently suicide. But the remarkable thing was this tracker who, after almost more than a week or so after a rainstorm and all sorts of other things, could track this guy across the plateau. So we've, it was kind of an interesting story, unfortunate ending to it. But this is the kind of thing. For example, my great-great-grandfather, there's an article in the newspaper in Beaver, Utah, about the fact that he got all of his wash stolen off the line. I mean, you never know what they're going to come. And there was not a lot of stuff happening in these small towns across the United States. And the amazing things reported. Every time somebody came into town, they would report it. Every time a visitor came in, any visitors, any relatives, anybody had a baby, anybody got married, anything happened, somebody got sick, it's all there in the newspapers. And so it's interesting that we now have ability to search some of these newspapers, because the ones that have been digitized, you can search. Some of the websites have the ability to actually highlight any search term, so you can go right to the articles and see where the news is. Others just give you the news page, and then you have to sit there and read the whole page to figure out where your guy is mentioned. So it may be very difficult. It'll take a little bit of time. Okay, well, we're going to start off with the Library of Congress, and I mentioned that there was a way of determining which newspapers had been printed in any particular place in the United States. And this is the U.S. newspaper directory, 1690 to the present. This is free. It's loc.gov, loc.gov, and that is Library of Congress. The U.S. newspaper directory is in the Chronicling America Digital Newspaper Project, and they have over 10 million pages, completely searchable, word for word, for free online from the Library of Congress. So this is where I would usually start, because it's free, and they have a very good search engine. You can put in exact words on their advanced search and come up with the names of your people. And I've had some very good results in finding some interesting articles about my ancestors from the Library of Congress. The U.S. Newspapers Directory goes back, as it says, to 1690. And in that, what it does is it gives you the ability to search through a state and a county. And what I usually do is, when someone is looking for a newspaper article about their ancestor, I'll say, well, where'd they live? And we'll finally come up with a county. And I'll say, okay, the time period involved. And so then we would look in the U.S. newspaper directory, and we put in the name of the state and the county, and you get a list back of all the newspapers that were printed in that county ever. And the advantage of that is that it tells you all the newspapers. The disadvantage is most of the people look at the lists, and sometimes there's 60 or 70 or 80 newspapers that have been published in that one county. And you go through and find that maybe there's 10 or 15 that were being published at the time that your people lived in the county. And my answer is, go read the newspapers. And they say, well, what do you mean, read the newspapers? I said, yeah, I mean, start on page 1 and read the newspapers, every one of the pages. And they go, you're kidding. And I said, no, I'm not kidding. That's exactly what the process is. It's called reading the newspapers. Just go through and you read for content. You try to find anything about your ancestor that may be in the paper. Now, that's what happens when the papers are on microfilm. So if you have to read a microfilm copy, then you are basically in the process of reading the newspaper. Now, that it becomes, interestingly enough, it becomes a very good incentive to do good genealogical research. Because if you know when they got married, then it's pretty easy to get to the newspaper that you're looking for and find the date and maybe a week or two before and after for announcements and whatever. You can get to that information. But if you just have kind of a vague idea that they may have lived in this county, you got a lot of pages to read, and the answer is, now going back to my original example, when they come in and say, we've looked everywhere, and my answer is, after I've shown them the list of 30 or 40 newspapers, to say, oh, you mean you've read every one of these newspapers all the way through? And they go, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you said everywhere, and that would include all of these newspapers. So that's the key here, is that it's a great boon to us, a benefit to the genealogical researcher, to have digitized newspapers that have been had all their characters read through optical character recognition, because then we can sort of make a shortcut and not have to go through and read every single page of every single newspaper. Now, I just remembered another good example of some things that were pretty unusual. My wife, for example, we went out and looked for her father. We just stuck his name into one of the big databases and came up with an article, a whole bunch of articles. In fact, it looked like once a week there was an article about him in the Ogden Examiner up in Ogden, Utah. And so we found the paper and searched all over the page. We couldn't find out what it was, but we found it in a little advertisement for a radio station that he and her brother were on the radio every Wednesday night. He played the accordion and his brother played the guitar. And so they had a little announcement in the newspaper every week about this radio show they were doing. And my wife would say, I never knew that. I had no idea that's what he did. So you find all sorts of things that you're not looking for. You might find, like I have on occasion, that a few of my ancestors ended up in court on various criminal charges, but that's just one of the benefits of doing genealogical research. Okay, so one of the things that happened a few years ago was that Google did two things. One is they had a goal of digitizing every book ever published. And then they had a goal, they decided to expand that to digitizing every newspaper. Well, books are books, but newspapers turned out to be a real challenge. The reason why we have so many different online websites and so many different places where newspapers are kept is just because of the nature of the newspaper. And it's also extremely difficult to get what you call full runs, or all of the editions of a specific newspaper. A lot of times, those only place that they were kept would have been in a local library, where the librarian just piled the newspapers up as they came in and had a big pile of newspapers. Well, you're going to go in there and make sure you've got the whole thing in correct, and then in order and correct and everything, and then you're going to take these very large sheets of paper and scan them into a computer. It's quite a challenge. Well, after a few years of trying to do this, Google just said, okay, well, we're not doing that anymore. But they did end up with a very large collection of newspapers online. And if you go to Google Newspaper Archive and just do a search on Google for the newspapers, you'll come up with their directory for the editions that they have. And once again, we're back to the situation where you need to know where an event occurred in your ancestor's life, and you need to be able to localize it and get it to the point where you know which newspapers. Now, here's the kind of good news, bad news about that situation. The good news is if you find out that they were married or they died or whatever happened to their lives in a specific location, and you search the newspapers and you search the local newspapers, you may think, well, great, pat yourself on the back, you've done a great job. And the answer is, you haven't even begun starting. For example, the great-great-grandfather that I mentioned in Beaver, Utah, which is not really southern Utah, more central Utah, but it's a little tiny town out now it's on the freeway. Well, he didn't have a freeway back when he lived there. He would have liked it, I'm sure, but they didn't have the freeway. But his death notices, his obituaries and death notices ended up in the newspapers in Salt Lake and Ogden, 300 miles north. So you can't really, you really can't stop looking just because you've identified the specific place. You really have to think in terms of regional newspapers, and that might have picked up a story from a small town newspaper and republished it. Okay, so Google gives you a pretty good one. Now, one of the largest online newspaper archives today is called newspaperarchive.com, and it is owned by MyHeritage, or at least licensed by MyHeritage, and they have over 140 million records, meaning 140 million pages of newspaper. Compared that to the 10 million pages in the Library of Congress, for example. So it's more than 10 times as many newspaper pages. And so when you have this huge collection, you can keep searching. The advantage, of course, of MyHeritage is that if you have this is a subscription website. If you have a subscription, you can put your pedigree on there, your file, your family file, and they will automatically search all these newspapers for you and provide you with record matches or record hints that tell you that you have a newspaper article about your ancestor. And this is really one of the more surprising things that people find when they're involved with MyHeritage, is they get all this information out of the newspapers that they didn't know existed. So this is one of the very active newspaper archives. Elefind is another huge online newspaper website. Actually, this particular company is in New Zealand, and they have over 2,745,000 newspapers. That's not pages, that's the number of newspapers they have, and over 2,000 different newspaper titles indexed on their website. And then we have the granddaddy of all websites on the internet, probably the largest one website with more digitized pages and digital information than any other website that I'm aware of, and that's trove.nla.gov.au. This is the National Library of Australia. It's the Australian governmental National Library. And they, at the time I did this slide, they had 472 million, almost 473 million digitized items in their vast resources. One of the comments that I always get back when I mention Trove is that, well, they're in Australia, and they say, well, I don't have any family in Australia. And I say, well, where did your family come from? And they say, well, England, Great Britain, Western Europe. And I say, well, where do you think the people in Australia came from? And they say, well, probably the same place. And I said, yeah, and they're probably got your relatives there in Australia, and you just don't know it. And so that's the case, and plus the fact when you get a website that is this big. Now, good news, bad news about this one is that most of this is available for free and readily accessible. Some of the content is not available unless you have a library card from the National Library and access to the National Library is in there in Australia. Likewise, we have the British Newspaper Archive. This particular one is run by the same company that does FindMyPast.com, which is a subscription service. And the British Newspaper Archive is also part of the same company, Find My Past, but it's a separate subscription. So if you have a subscription to Find My Past, that does not automatically get you a subscription to the British Newspaper Archive. And they have another 13.5 million pages of information. All the numbers that I quote here are definitely approximate, because the numbers of, as they're continually digitizing additional newspapers. So the numbers are going to go up on every one of these. Second. Okay. And of course, we have some here at home. Here at BYU Family History Library, we have a huge bank of cabinets, and we also have, through the computers here in the library, we have access to a number of these large online digital newspapers. I don't think I mentioned Ancestry.com. Ancestry.com has quite a few newspapers in Ancestry, but they also have their newspapers.com website where they have a huge collection online. I, this is kind of an interesting situation because in doing a webinar on a subject like digital newspapers, it's sort of a balance. You could simply sit here for an entire hour and give you slide after slide of newspaper sites. And I'm going to have a reference to a list that I did last year. I thought about it and I thought, well, I'm just going to list all the digital newspaper sites that I know about in the United States. So I started through my list and then I started working on it more consistently. Well, eventually I figured out that I had bitten off a rather large project, which took me over 3 months of searching online and listing newspaper sites in every single state in the United States, and literally hundreds of different websites that had digital newspapers. So it's no way in the world that we can cover all of the newspaper sites that are out there, and that's why I suggested doing Google searches right at the beginning. And it's relatively easy to find the listings of all these sites because they just keep going and going. So what I was using as a search was I would put in newspaper, and then I put the word digital, and then I put online, and then I put the state that I was looking for. So here, if I was looking for California online newspapers, I would put in newspaper, digital, online, California, and then all of the locations for newspapers that were online and digitized for California would come up. Sometimes I'd have to vary the words a little bit to get more information, find a few more websites, but generally they're pretty much out there. Once again, reminding you that they may be free and they may not be free. They may be a subscription or a lot of different varieties of ways charging per even per copy or per view. This is a sample state newspaper collection, California digital newspapers, and these came about as a result of the Library of Congress, their digital newspaper, the Chronicling America Digital Newspaper Project. And what they did was they said, well, we'll digitize the papers, put them on the Library of Congress website, or we will provide funding for the states to set up their own state digital newspaper projects. So many of the states have taken advantage of that funding that was available and created their own digital newspapers websites for each of the states. So you need to go back and look through each state's records. So here we have about 1.2 million pages. Now the number of pages it gives you an idea of the possibility of finding information, but the same rule applies to any big online database. That is, if they have what you're looking for, it's wonderful. If they don't have what you're looking for, then it doesn't matter how many pages they have. Just because they have that many pages does not mean they necessarily have anything about your ancestor. And it also does not mean that when you've looked at this one website that you've done anything that you could call a complete search of the newspapers for California. Now, ultimately, I'm going to have to say that regardless, I understand we're talking about online digital newspapers, but eventually you run out of the digital newspapers. You may go through every page that's online for a specific county or whatever. And it still is a good idea to always either contact directly or go to the place and start asking in museums and local libraries about their newspaper collections, because these very, very local newspapers may only still be sitting in a pile of paper someplace in a storage room or on a library shelf someplace in one of these libraries. Here's another sample. This is Illinois. Understanding that this collection of newspapers, 57 newspaper titles with over 1 million pages in Illinois, is basically in addition to any of the other websites. So if you looked in newspapers.com or newspaperarchives.com or any of the other large online digital websites like Newsbank, that is another one. Most of the time, they have a partner program called Genealogy Bank that is a subscription, and they have a huge collection of digital newspapers. But these local sites may have newspapers, and probably do have newspapers, that are not duplicated in the very large online websites. And then we have another one here is Missouri, and the Missouri Digital Newspaper Project. And that's this, as I mentioned earlier, finding these is simply a matter of putting in newspaper as a search, plus digital, plus online, and then the name of the state. Now this is one that's pretty close to home here in Utah, the Utah Digital Newspaper Project. One of the things that's happened in the Utah Digital Newspaper Project is that it's very, very complete. This one was sponsored by the University of Utah, and through the national project with the Library of Congress. But this covers a very high percentage of all the newspapers published in Utah since the Europeans began to get here in the 1840s, early 1850s. So this is a tremendous resource for information in Utah. The website works very well. You can get into this website just by typing in Utah Digital Newspapers. And basically, the interesting here is this is where I've gotten a lot of the information about my ancestors, is out of this particular website. One of the things in the comments that I've had when I've told people about this is that I say, this is the kind of site, they'll come back and they'll say, oh, I wish you hadn't told me about that. I spent my whole week reading all those old newspapers. It was just a kick, all of the things that's there. So you really have to understand that there is a lot of information here, and it may have even overwhelming. On the other hand, it's just like I said, it's sort of it can be boom or bust. You could be in the situation where you could search through all these different newspaper projects and still not find any mention of your ancestors. Maybe your guys were very good at avoiding getting their names in the newspapers. Now, there are a lot of specialty newspaper collections. These are usually associated with the university library or a university, some kind of a university department, sometimes the communications or journalism department. And in this case, there was a Portuguese-American digital newspaper. So it's also helpful. This is the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth that has this particular collection online. Sometimes with the university collections, if they have a special collection department in their library, that they may have used that part of the library to put this type of information online. And in these cases, once again, sometimes they're free. Sometimes they're free, but they're only accessible through the university's computers. In other words, you have to be on the campus or in the library to gain access to these particular records. It depends on the conditions that have been imposed by whoever it is that supplied the information to the university. I mentioned my article, and this is Genealogy Star, and if you look under my name, or you put in Genealogy Star and then you put digital newspapers, it'll take you right to the long list that I spent 3 months compiling of all the digital newspapers that were websites that I could find in the United States. Sorry if some of them have gone out of business in the last year, and maybe some more have come online. No plans right now to update the project. It took too long. The answer here, folks, is to keep looking. It is virtually impossible, and one of the things I like to say in a lot of classes when I look around at the people in attendance, and I say, none of us, even if you're a lot younger than I am, none of us are going to live long enough to look everywhere. So we can just keep looking, and we'll keep finding more information about our ancestors. But I would recommend that digital newspaper projects around the world have now been created that will provide a huge amount of information. Now, as a kind of a coda, at the end of the little add-on here at the end of the broadcast, what I would point out is that nationally, internationally, there are a lot of countries that are involved in preserving what they call their national heritage through digitizing their newspapers. So in places like Netherlands, even some Germany countries like Germany, England, France, many of these countries today are involved, and even some of the smaller countries of the world are involved in digitizing their newspapers. So if you keep looking online, that you should be able to find access some way or another to large newspaper collections in most of the larger online countries of the world. Thanks for listening and or watching, and tune in next time for another webinar. Our schedule for webinars at BYU Family History Library is on our BYU Family History Library webpage with a link to the schedules coming up in the next couple of months. The videos are also, all of these webinars are also being recorded and will be available on the BYU Family History Library website and also on the BYU Family History Library YouTube page at youtube.com. Just search for BYU Family History Library. Thank you for watching.